how they were making the scrolls. This is a view of my studio. This is a big screen that's going to fold up. That seam there is actually a physical line where the screen will lift off itself, and it'll fold very small, the size of a suitcase. And I went to the airport and figured out how big the biggest suitcase could be. They told me the dimensions, and I made this screen accordingly. So I carried all this work to, this is a 3-part screen where the 3 individual pieces are hung together with this system that I was talking about. I decided to add an octagon to this since the shape of the cathedral was an octagon. I wanted to somehow make it also marry with the space itself. So this is 4 shapes that are working together. And those plugs, those black plugs, had to do with a conference I went to on genetics and cloning, where they were talking about the DNA helix and unplugging certain genes that they didn't want anymore, like Down syndrome. They could find the gene, locate it, and potentially unplug it and be done with Down syndrome. And then the professor that was talking about this went on to say, is that something we want to do? Do we want to get rid of Down syndrome forever? Is this a positive thing? Because I'm sure if you talk to a parent of a Down syndrome kid, they say this kid is a gift. I mean, they're incredibly pleasant, wonderful beings. So you have this dichotomy, and the idea of it being unplugged, this was something that kind of stuck in my head, and that's how I found meaning for these shapes in the pictorial field. So these are some details of this series. And this is the show installed in Paris. And you could see, I mean, it's a big cathedral. And these are pretty big drawings that look like they're little matchboxes in there. That looks like a little matchbox. But I folded it up and took it home with me. So it forced me to think outside of the box on how to work, how I could, I wanted to have a show there. The work wasn't in place, and I had about 8 months to get something together. And thankfully it changed a lot. It changed a lot of the things I did after. I think this is a nice sequence, the way they look with the statuary. There's a nice poetic view. The other thing that was cool about this was the Paris Hospital, or the University of Paris Hospital, was directly behind it. So doctors would come walking through here, and the work was about genetics and cloning, and it was kind of an interesting relationship. That's a nice pairing, I think. Around 2008, I've been in Phoenix, which is where I am now, teaching at ASU, and I started to kind of get in touch with my environment, and I think it did change the work quite a bit. It's a really beautiful place that if you haven't ever been out there, you might not think you'd ever want to go there, and I was the same way. And then when I got off the plane for the interview that day a long time ago, I said, wow, this place is really beautiful. And I've never looked back. I think it's a wonderful environment. This is kind of a radical jump, but I did a panel discussion with another scientist from ASU that was dealing with cloning and genetics, and the way he was imaging his work was he was using a diagonal and the ACGT tag and organizing these things through a computer somehow, and he would set the work like dynamically, symmetrically, but opposed to itself on a diagonal, so he could see if there were any patterns that were developing. So I went to his lab and started looking at his work and wondered if it would have any impact on the, and about a week later, I just started cutting the things with a diagonal. And that little simple act radically changed the work. And it made this next piece happen, which also happened because of what I think happened in Paris with the hinge building. This is literally a screen that folds, will shut on itself. And I started to think of like the way cells could multiply and divide like this if they were pressed against each other. So, and the action that happens when you walk around the piece almost is dynamic. It's not, like as you move, the piece kind of folds and opens up. So I kind of liked that idea, that dynamism. This was a piece, maybe I'll go back and show you that. That's the piece in a whole. That's a detail of the piece. But this is a flat piece that then the two far ends, the two opposite diagonal ends, are brought together and touch. And it stays together like that on the wall. And it unfolds completely. So it could be shipped very easily. And you could kind of see the hinges there. And here you could really see the hinges. This piece was, I think, the first one where I started to really get a sense of the landscape and the fact that, like, there's large plains of rock that are cut and broke and twisted and turned. And I think that that started to begin to affect the work. But that's paper, that's wood first, then foam core, then the hinges are built, then paper, then drawing. So the last act is the drawing. And that's a little nerve-wracking because they usually take me about 3 months to build. So I started to spend a lot of time up in southern Utah, and there's a lot of really interesting rock formations. The place is just incredible. This is a cliff that drops off about 2,000 feet. And you're up on this ledge, and there's all this kind of molten rock that left all these cracks and crevices, and you could just walk around it. So I started to take photographs of it and also do sketches while I was there and measure the rocks. Literally take the dimensions of the rocks with big long tapes and took those numbers back to the studio and started to work on these simple graph drawings, trying to give it meaning, give it proportional relationship, tie it back to some kind of structural geometry, and came up with a piece like this. Muley Point was that place I showed you. That's what that's called. So these are reference back to that site. And this is 2 pieces of wood and, with a paper skin that's kind of cracked in the center, like those rock formations were. Yeah, this was the rock it was taken from. So it's like it was one rock and then it was broken. And the piece was one piece and then it was cut. This is a second piece. This is Muley Point 2. I want to show you the rock formation here. So those overlapping rocks kind of were the impetus for this. And I did some measurements. I went back to the studio, did a drawing like this, set up the axis. I do them to scale, like using a scale ruler, so I know exactly how big to draw it. And then I'll draw it to full scale and then work off of that to build the piece. This is the piece built as I drew it. So you could see it literally did come out of one piece of wood. I mean, I had to make there was a lot of building here, but I cut it and screwed it back together to do the drawing and then built all the back apparatus to get it to hang and twist and turn the way I wanted it to. And that's kind of a close-up of it. In April of this last year, I went to the Grand Gulch, which is a preserve that they only let 8 people a day into. And once you enter, you could probably do a day trip and see maybe 1 or 2 things. But if you plan to do the full, 28-mile backpack trip through the Grand Gulch, you'll see, I don't know, maybe we saw 15 or 20 different Pueblo Indian ruins that are untouched. So that they restrict the area because they just haven't had the time to excavate it yet. So you could walk right up into these dwellings. This is a multi-story, this is a story, this is a story, this is another area of it, and they must have had, some kind of laddering device that they would pull up at night to get up there. You walk into these sites, there's corn still on the ground, there's pot chars, the wall's black from the fire, and you're kind of really in this really tactile, physical, real, but 1,200-year-old space that's basically been untouched. So it was a pretty cool trip. I've done other trips like that. These are some of the Indian paintings, and I want to talk about that in a little bit. But the idea that there's something inside of us that makes us want to communicate visually. So I mean, you think of things like these traditional American Indian paintings, you think of things like in the clay caves of Lascaux, that there's some kind of internal impulse to be creative and to visually explain your world. So I started doing these really tiny drawings. They're only about this big, and I've done many of them now. But they help me kind of get in touch with almost a language that I'm trying to understand, my own personal language, my way of communicating my thoughts about the universe in a certain way. And they've been a lot of fun to make, and they're kind of quiet, but they're an hour 2 hours, and maybe some are three sittings, and some are one sitting. And I don't worry as much about them anymore, and I just let them be. But I started to kind of think of them in those terms about this. They're just about this desire to communicate visually in a language that maybe you understand or maybe you don't understand, but potentially you understand that there's some kind of communication going on there. So these smaller pieces are about that idea, but they're still using the same kind of like systematical growth system that I developed, years ago. And like that thing, where does something like that come from? And I kind of get excited when it just pops up like that. I don't even know what it means. It looks like a ship to me or something like that, but it's silly and I like it. I showed you the other book earlier that I kind of spent time with. More recently, I've been reading this book, and it's much more scientifically oriented. It's not really for the artist, it's for the scientist. And in it are a lot of things I don't understand, but some things I do understand. And I came upon this page that had these beautiful drawings about something that he referred to as a catastrophe. And it's like a flexing that happens in the earth when all this energy kind of converges in one place, and the earth can't kind of hold it together anymore, and it just collapses on itself. So it's this catastrophic event. And much of the area that I live in, this happened. This kind of energy took place. And I didn't really know what it all meant, but I did do a lot of drawings after this. Like I just started drawing these shapes and trying to understand their essence, I guess. And not much after that, I came upon this simple idea of just creating a square and trying to get it to arc physically one direction and the other direction just optically by cutting it. And I started to try to make that shape. And this is pretty recent piece that literally is physically bent, but also is cut. Like the bottom's cut and the sides bend. Maybe, can you see it better there, the arc? Yeah. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. So I hope that kind of helps tie these two worlds, my interest in the ancient art, early Renaissance art, and what I'm doing right now. And that's kind of it. So that. So is that confusing? It confuses me. But I think that the lesson there, if there is one, is to just not worry about it. Just follow the things you're interested in. Whether it's in the sciences or in the arts. If you're passionate about what you're doing and you're truly interested in these things but don't necessarily know why, don't worry about it. It's going to take care of itself. And each of you have this unique experience that's truly yours. It's not even your brothers or your sisters. It's truly yours. And if you follow that, you're going to be, your own person. You're going to make original art if you follow that truly, I think, and follow that path. So I think that would be the one thing I'd want to leave you with, is that idea that these things fall into place later. Just be passionate and work hard, and the rest is going to take care of itself. I mean, it is what it is, right? Whether you like it or not, I stopped worrying about that. And that's another thing too, I guess. Right, Jim? You can't worry about what people think. Yeah. Any questions?
How else you could be surprised?
Right. You have to, and the time in the studio, as you get older, you're going to realize the time in the studio is more and more valuable. So when you get there, you might as well do what you want to do. You know what I mean? That's your freedom, really. The rest of life is just going to pick at you. So in the studio, you should just be happy. Right? Or your research, whatever that is. You should enjoy it somehow. There's a lot that goes with it that isn't fun, but there's aspects, those times that you really are on your own, you should be somehow find pleasure in that, I think. And it should be rewarding somehow. You guys have any questions? Yeah.
You talked about how you would start from a certain place with a piece, and then you would just sort of develop it and keep sort of adding to it and changing it, and then until you got to the end.
Right.
My question is, how do you know you got to the end of it, and why not?
The funny thing is you do know. You know. It tells you. And sometimes it tells you in a day, and sometimes it takes never. I mean, there's paintings I've worked on. That painting I worked on for a long period of time. And I have one that I started that was the exact same size as that one, right next to it in the studio, and it's still not done. And that was probably a year and a half ago. So that one, I can't get a break in that one. And the big paintings take a lot of energy, and I need the focus and the time. And that's how you get them to come to life. Otherwise, if I'm just kind of touching it from the outside, it's never going to happen. So I just put it away. That's where the little drawings, because I'm in academia, and certain times of the year are crazy, and other times are quieter, and I could focus on that. That's where those little drawings became a little savior in a way, because I could move in and out of them pretty quickly. So that's important too, to set up a studio or a research situation where there's things you could solve maybe with short periods of time, and there's bigger things that you're working over at a long period of time. But as far as knowing, I think that goes with education. You know what I mean? The more you train yourself, whatever discipline it is, the more knowledge you have, the more you know when something works or not, even if there isn't a set answer. And usually the ones I think work, other people see it and say, and the ones I don't, and I somehow let out of the studio anyway, that I don't think it's quite as good as that other one, that's the one that goes. People see it somehow. They identify it too, even though they don't know what they're looking at. Do you have a question? Yeah.
Yeah. I was just wondering, are you influenced by certain modern artists or modern movements?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a lot of people you would say that influenced me in there. I just decided not to go that route. I mean, I thought that was enough information to deal with in one day. I mean, my head hurts, right? So I don't know. But I mean, the obvious people would be like Bryce Martin. I love his work. Mangold. Howard Hodgkins. Love his work, even though it's not quite visible there but you could see it in my early work, I think. Dorothea Rockburn, I don't know if you know who she is, but she did that big mural in the media union. Is it still there, Jim?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was her assistant on that. So that had a huge effect. About that time, too, when I was working things out, she killed me, but she was worth all the time I put in there. She was really demanding, nasty and demanding. But I learned a lot. So, that was a good experience, I think. But of course, I'm always looking at those people. But you don't want to look too much. Yeah. You want to respect them, and you want to be able to identify the ones that are really doing special things, at least for you, I think, which, is a moving target, really, because the people I liked, like I showed Monet, but I don't go to a museum now to hunt out a Monet. But there was a time I would have, and as your tastes change, so do your, the people that you want to see and study and look after and get immersed in, I think, change. But more, I think, as I get older, I get more interested in ideas and other issues than art, let's say. That's what feeds the work. It isn't necessarily art that feeds the work. Although I still go to museums and love seeing stuff like that, but that has lessened as I get older, I think. Especially where I live now. There's very little culture. It's not like a place like this. That's what I mean. You have to really respect where you are now. But there is this whole other thing with the American Indian art and the incredible landscape. The Sonoran Desert, which I live right on the edge of, is the second most diverse ecological system in the world, second only to the rainforest. So the plants in this place are amazing. So it really is truly beautiful. So I'll get on my bike, like I'll finish work maybe on a Friday night at 5 o'clock, and I might have like 45 minutes or so before sunset. Now I'm close enough where I can get on my bike and get up a mountain in like 20-25 minutes and see like an incredible sunset, and in this desert. So I think that has fed me in a very different way than what had happened maybe 8 years before that in another location. And you have to be sensitive to that kind of environmental impact. Don't you think we should be? I think we should be. Yeah, I think we should be. Yes?
Were you always interested in biology and science, or did that interest come from?
I think a lot of it had to do with being in a place like the University of Michigan, where it was so much a fabric of your experience. But I think I've always been interested in trying to understand how things work. You know, whether it be how something grows or changes, you know, picking up a pine cone and really, you know, what is this? What's beautiful about this? Why is it beautiful? How did it work? How did it become what it is? And I think that that's where the geometry helped me tie that together, that interest in how something's built or formed. And there's particularly that sequential growth system, the way something starts very simple but can get very complex, and the beginning point, there's no indication really of what the end point is. That to me is exciting. In that sense, I almost feel like I'm in the creative, you know, I'm creating, truly, because I don't know what this thing is, and I don't know what this thing will look like. And the bad part of that is I don't know what this thing is going to look like. And in a market where I try to sell my work, I have a gallery, and they want results. You know, they want the work to be done, they want the work to be consistent, and that becomes a problem because I'm not consistent, really. I mean, I guess I am more than I was when I was young, but I still can't, like that painting that still beat me up, I think at this point, after doing this 30 years, I should be able to go into the studio and finish a painting, and I can't. And I developed this really stupid way of trying to make a painting. But I love it. You know, it's like that's how I developed how to make a painting. If I had decided to just stay and keep painting landscapes, I'm sure I could paint landscapes, and I'm sure I'd sell landscapes. You know what I mean? That's like a definite. But is that really what we're trying to do here? Then that to me seems like a job. That doesn't seem like something that's compelling or interesting. Yeah.
Do you ever feel like you made progress by copying or mimicking something and then felt?
I didn't talk about that, did I?
No.
All right. So in that period, that 5-year period after graduate school, when I wasn't allowed to copy master paintings in graduate school, I came to my studio. I bought a macro lens because there wasn't the internet and all that stuff then. There were just books. I bought a macro lens, which allowed my camera to get really close on a photograph. And I got all my art books, which I have a lot of, and I started to pick them and mark the pages, and I'd get rolls of film, and I started taking pictures of my favorite paintings. And I developed a card catalog with maybe 150 of these paintings in them. And I took them to my studio, and I started to copy the paintings. And I started to do...
Oil painting with an oil painting.
Right. And what I did was I went and took photographs of the River Raisin, like the landscape that I lived in, and I integrated that with the figurative properties of these beautiful figure and landscape paintings, like a Bellini, or maybe even a Caravaggio. You know, just take the black out of it and put the landscape in. But I did a whole series of those. And what I learned, actually, was, and this was important, I learned that Bellini, Rembrandt, Van der Weyden, Michelangelo, no matter who I copied, they dealt with space and the areas between the figures so radically differently. And you cannot understand this when you're just looking at the image. I don't know how many of you have gone to a museum and have copied, like in a sketchbook, copied a great painting. How much more do you learn about that painting by copying it versus just standing there for 5 minutes and looking at it? You learn. You'd be surprised how much you learn, actually. So spending about 3 years copying those paintings taught me about the unique nature of each of those painters' space, and that really was the issue. That's really what they were painting. They weren't painting figures. They weren't painting a Madonna. They weren't painting a Christ child. They were painting space. And when you look at someone like de Kooning, that's what he's doing. He's not painting figures. He's not painting landscape. He's painting space. And if you could understand that that's really, to me, what's been painted, Velázquez, you know, I mean, what could be more spatial than that? It's all just surrogates for them trying to understand how they're going to deal with edges and color to create space. And with de Kooning, it was this much. He said all the space he needed was from his fingertips to his elbow. And if you think of his paintings, that's how deep they are. So that became really an important lesson. And that 5-year period from 1995 to 2000, I don't think I showed 3 times. Like I didn't worry about showing. I didn't show my work. And then once I came out and started doing those drawings, those first couple of drawings, then I started to show it. And those.
Did you feel kind of guilty by copying?
About copying? Oh,
You
no.
always felt really good about it.
Yeah, I never worried about that. I think that we could learn so much from those guys. I mean, you look at those paintings, they're just, I make my painting one students do it. And inevitably, that's their favorite project. Now, we take like a Caravaggio. I might have had them do a really rigid, like geometrical painting with tape and acrylic. Then they would have done like a glazing problem with like apple still life and fabric. And then we would have done a painting with open form, like big blocks of paint, chunky like a mosaic. I buy them a whole tube of white paint, like a big tube, and I said, you don't stop working on the paint until you use the whole tube of white. And so they've had like this hard edge issue, they've had this glazing problem that they work on for a long time, and then they've had this real open-ended textural painting, and then I make them copy like a Rembrandt, who really does all those things simultaneously. And they take a little section of a Rembrandt and try to make the paint do what Rembrandt's doing with glazing and opacity and edges, or Velasquez, he's another one I'll let them copy, and they like it. And I think it's a good lesson. Yeah.
Can you maybe just talk about the role of color in the painting?
Well, there isn't much, is there?
No, I'm sure it's purposeful. So.
It seems like as these ideas have developed, color associates a different meaning in a way that is kind of loaded. And black and white is like much more like graphic and direct. And there's something about the drawings now that really speak to me. And to see them in person, they're real tactile. And I have developed a special way of spraying them where I leave them raw. And then I seal them with like a UV sensitive varnish that I spray on like 25 coats with an air spraying system that I developed from a distance. So when the stuff hits it, it's almost dry. And it doesn't change what it looks like. So it looks as powdery and nasty and gritty and dirty as it does if you didn't spray it. So I kind of like that tactile. Like when I look at someone like Rembrandt or Velasquez or Titian, I see incredible tactile understanding, how the paint feels, not just looks. Not what it's depicting, but what it senses. You not only see the painting, but you feel the painting, I think. And I think that has to do with the tactile resonance of the piece. So I'm real sensitive to that. And I haven't been able to get the paint to do that. The two paintings that are in the Life Science Institute were done here in Michigan. And then I moved to Texas and taught in Texas for 4 years. And then I moved to Arizona and was working with the same paint, it's called Lascal, and it's called Aquacryl. And it's really like a super hybrid watercolor that's really, really dense chromatically and very thin. It has no binders in it, so you have to bind it. And I was mixing marble dust, like the Life's Moment and Piano Lesson, or that paint with marble dust. And I was working with the canvas on the wall with brushes on sticks, and literally like washing down the whole painting with yellow or washing down the whole painting with blue. When I moved to Arizona, it's so dry. The percentage some days is like 4%, that I'd put the thing on, and I could get halfway down the painting and it would stick and dry. And it just was all like bumpy and ugly, so I went to oils. And I don't think I've still gotten oils to settle down. They're just, so I think what I'm gonna do is when I get some more time, I'm gonna get some retardant, which they now make. They make things to slow up the drying for acrylics, and see if it does anything. And maybe try to paint those paintings again. Or a new way. Yeah.
When you talk about that you don't actually know what's gonna come out when you do your paintings, have you ever thought of like how your unique processes feel, like how you get involved with the geometry and like those really precise measurements about the nature and landscape? How does it end up like doing this or not? Why is that pretty well? Is it because like it's like how our
Well, I don't know if it looks pretty in your eyes, right?
I think it does.
Okay.
It doesn't look like it's end up from randomness choices.
It doesn't look random. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
I think that well, there's both elements at play. And I think that there is a randomness once it gets started. But then I'm like a conductor, I guess. I'm orchestrating where it's heading. And I think that potentially is enough to lead it to a sweet spot. And then I think the ideas, the things I'm thinking about in my head while I'm drawing, enter in and help dictate that a little bit. Whether it's, Indian, American Indian painting, or it's cell structures, or some other ideas sometimes your child or something that happened at home. But I mean, I don't know how many people, there are some painters in the room, I think, and some people that draw. And when you start doing it, you kind of lose yourself a little bit. Don't you? Doesn't your mind go somewhere else? You did a lot of research, Leah. You have a PhD, don't you? Right? So your PhD is in research, right?
Yes.
What happened in the lab? Were there times you were doing certain tasks that allowed you to free associate and think differently? Or did you always have to be in that moment? Do you understand what I mean? Do you understand the difference?
Not quite.
Not quite?
I'm trying to make the connection with her question.
Yeah, I'm trying to too. In that, I think that that's the intuitive part. I think that's the part that can't be explained. If there's magic anywhere in this, that's the magic. Is seeing if you can get something to kind of come from this association of interests somehow. But there's no set plan. But I know the ones that work. Like the last one I showed you. Oh, it started at the beginning. That one. I knew when I finished it that I really liked it. I didn't know why, I didn't know how, I didn't even know how I did it. But it was really hard working on the curve. And it really changed the whole dynamic of its creative process. And I'm working on a second one that I had hoped to have done because I sequenced it the whole time. I wanted to show you guys how it grew, but I couldn't resolve it. It's close, but it's just not resolved. So I don't think I have an answer, I guess. I talked around that a lot, but I don't think I really know. And I do think that that's kind of a problem. Yeah.
You have a generative system, and I think all of us do.
Yeah.
Which is to say a set of parameters that you discover over time, that you pursue often enough that they generate results, sometimes more intentionally than
Right.
others. So you demonstrated a very ordered generative system for us, which is fascinating. The question on the floor about how do you know when it's done